The word philosophy, as you probably know, comes from the ancient Greek philosophia, the love of wisdom. And so I have a bit of a strange question to start with. Is philosophy more like dance, or is it more like ballet? No, I don't mean the actual techniques. The question is it like dance, a universal human phenomenon that is expressed differently in different cultures, but is always recognizably dance? Or is it like ballet, a particular thing that arose in a particular time in a particular place? So there's a tendency to tell the story of how all of this came about as, there was nothing, right? And then suddenly, around 2,500 years ago, there was a miracle in the part of the world that we now call Greece, and suddenly there was mathematics and literature and philosophy and all those things. To take nothing away from the greatness of the great thinkers and writers of that time, that is obviously not what happened. So is philosophy a universal thing? Well, if I had an hour, and I'm being told I do not have an hour, I would have gone through a list of criteria, going one bunch. I would look by this criteria and by that criteria. Pick any reasonable set of criteria for what counts as real philosophy that you want, and you will find non-Western philosophy, significant chunks of it, meet that just fine. So you might say, okay, fine, we're convinced, but who on earth is arguing against this? Well, you'd be surprised. So whether or not something gets to have the label philosophy makes a difference. It's not just a name. It's not just, it's taught in the philosophy department, or it's taught in the religious studies department, or regional studies department of one kind or another. What does it matter? It matters because whether something is taught at all, how it is taught, by whom, is it part of the regular curriculum? Does a medium or large size university, is such a place expected to have experts in that? All of those things definitely do depend on the label. Now, for many years now, there has been incredibly strong student demand among those who take philosophy courses, philosophy majors, and so on, to include and to have more courses in non-Western philosophy. A demand that has met very little supply, unfortunately. There has been some acceptance, but also a lot of pushback. Now, just because people are asking for something doesn't mean that, that it's the right thing to do. But there are very good educational reasons from the point of view of teaching philosophy, which is, what I do, to do that, to make the effort to expand and to include non-Western philosophy. And the reason for that is, well, there are many reasons, but one simple reason is, look, we live in a world nowadays that is extremely interconnected. And so the humanities in general should be about humanity, all of it. If the humanities can still convince people that it's worth supporting and having and learning and funding, it's because it allows us to get a better understanding of ourselves, individually, collectively, and of other people. Again, other people around us, other people in the world. And so it is also pedagogically the right thing to do. But there's an even deeper reason, and perhaps no less important reason, to insist on the label of philosophy, even though there has been some quite significant pushback against it. So if the struggle to have recognition for, let's say, philosophy from India, philosophy from China, and so on, recognized, that struggle has been far worse for the recognition of another major or set of traditions in world philosophy, namely African philosophy. I'm sorry, this is the only long quote in the entire thing, don't worry. But let's read this together because this is very important. So this is from a text by Kwame Gyekye, who sadly passed away a few years ago. And it goes like this. To deny two African peoples philosophical thought is to imply that they are unable to make philosophical sense of or to conceptualize their experiences. It is, in fact, to deny them their humanity. For philosophy of some kind is behind the thought and action of every people. It constitutes the intellectual sheet anchor of their life in totality. And so this denial that non-Western philosophy can really be philosophy. This denial that African thought is not just a set of customs or sayings or stories, but constitutes African philosophy. Of course, is not one thing. There are many different cultures and peoples, but that tradition as a whole does not constitute a tradition of philosophy is coming downstream historically from what I think everyone nowadays will agree is horrendously wrong colonialist racism, denying full humanity to non-European peoples, to African peoples. Yeah? And so you might ask, but wait, if things are so bad, why did it even get to be this way? So again, I'm restraining myself from giving the full story. The full story is in this very good book full of highly detailed textual evidence and historical evidence. But the short version is this. The ancient Greeks themselves did not think that they emerged out of nothing. There was darkness and suddenly the light came on, in Athens and its surrounding communities, roughly 2,500 years ago. They saw themselves as indebted to much older civilizations around them, the Egyptians, the Persians, and through the Persians, the ancient Near East, and so on and so forth. In fact, even if we fast forward to early modern Europe, to early modern European philosophers, we see that they are, once there starts to be regular contact with India, with China, in the 1500s, 1600s, early 1700s, they are quite happy to accept that those places have their own indigenous traditions of philosophy that do not fall in any way short of Western philosophy and sophistication and being worth the name philosophy. So what went wrong? I regret to say that what went wrong has to do especially with two of the greatest philosophers of all time. And what I'm about to say does not make them less great philosophers. It's just another of those cases of, somebody can be great in one way and absolutely awful in another way, both at the same time. So these two culprits, main culprits, are Immanuel Kant and a generation later Hegel. So two of the pillars of modern philosophy. Unfortunately, their tremendous intellectual authority was used also to support explicit, quote-unquote, color-based racism, according to which the again in scare quotes, the non-white races are simply incapable of any kind of higher abstract thought. So by definition, even if they have something that someone might say, oh, this looks like philosophy, no, it can't be philosophy because they are incapable of high-level abstract thought. So we don't even need to check if it's philosophy or not. It just can't be. And for many, many generations thereafter, the history of philosophy was written and taught with that assumption in mind. It starts with the Greeks, it continues through the Hellenistic period, the Romans, etc., 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 through to what we nowadays call Western philosophy. Yeah. Now, again, both concerning the quote from Kwame Gyeke and concerning this story here, I am not, let me be clear, I am not accusing people nowadays who push back and who argue against including non-Western philosophy. I'm not saying that they're racist. I'm not saying, no, absolutely not. What I'm saying is the origin of this exclusion is in explicitly racist thought that ought to make us very suspicious and very critical of that continuing exclusion. And as I've said, there are excellent reasons to end this exclusion, to work towards diversifying what we teach, expanding the scope of what is typically taught, right? Making it part of the regular curriculum and not something that maybe sometimes if someone happens to be passing through who's teaching it, right? So, I want to briefly comment on another kind of marginalization and exclusion that comes from partly similar motivations. It's not the main topic of my talk because this is not what I personally work on. This is not my area of expertise, but I want to recognize and acknowledge this as a parallel issue that needs a parallel kind of approach to solve it. And of course, a lot of work is already being done on addressing this. And this is the long-standing exclusion or marginalization of women from the history of philosophy, and very often from the course outlines, from the reading lists of courses in contemporary philosophy, where there is absolutely no conceivable excuse for it. And yet the problem is ongoing, and yet it's a continuing struggle to have this be recognized and resolved. All right, now, what can we say about, so someone might say, look, fine, I'm with you, I agree with you, in principle this would be great. But there are some serious problems here. Look, what universities are facing nowadays, especially in the humanities, when I say nowadays, I mean the last 20, 30, 40 years, yeah? A lot of days. So is constant pressure, budget cuts, staff cuts, faculty cuts. How on earth do you expect us to expand what we teach without being reasonably able to expect any kind of increased budget? Well, the answer is, well, I would love to see an increased social investment in universities and all levels of education. But since that's probably not happening, still, some things can be done. I'll just give two examples of the kinds of things that I personally work on a lot. Namely, even in what we already teach, we can rethink how we do it so as to include a lot more than the almost nothing that is nowadays usually included. For example, Intro to Philosophy is a very broad course heading. Lots of things can be Intro to Philosophy. There's absolutely no reason why Intro to Philosophy has to be some version of Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, and somebody from the 20th century. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But does that have to be the only way to do it? No, I would suggest to you. Similarly, when there are courses that are not explicitly about a specific time period of philosophy, if it's a course in 17th century European philosophy, fine, then that's what it should be about. But when courses are about topics of universal human and philosophical concern, ethics, politics, human nature, the good life, appearance and reality, the nature of the self, there's absolutely no reason not to expand the range of sources that we draw on for teaching students these things. Nevertheless, someone might say, but look, we don't have experts for these things. We don't have anybody able to read Sanskrit for, let's say, the traditions that come out of India, able to read classical Chinese, and so on and so forth. We just don't have anyone. So, as convincing as your pitch might have been, there's really nothing we can do. Maybe next time we have a position open, we'll try to hire someone. But until then, well, the answer is, once again, people who teach philosophy, we often end up teaching people when we cannot necessarily read the original language. Not everyone who teaches, let's say, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant is able to read classical Greek and French and German fluently in the original language. And yet we manage, don't we? So that doesn't need to be a barrier. Of course, ideally you would have a local expert doing this, but not having one is not in itself a reason to do this, not at all. Another objection might be, and this is perhaps the strongest objection raised against all the things I've just been saying. Money is not our only limitation. Time is another limitation, right? We get our students for a limited number of courses, whether it's a minor or a major or an honors. There's only so many courses, there's only so many hours of philosophy that we're giving them, and already we're making tough choices about what to include and what not to include. So, you want us to include more people? Fine. Why don't you tell us, who do you want to push off the curriculum, right? Well, the answer is, look, the canon, the things that we typically teach, has always been changing. You look at typical course outlines today, take a representative sample of universities, look at the same universities and their outlines, if you can find them. Let's imagine you can find them in an archive somewhere. 50 years ago, you'll see it's very different. Even 20 years ago, it would be different. It's fine. We are always rethinking the canon. We are always revising the curriculum. And yes, of course, we can't include everything. But once again, we have always been making changes. The question is not, can we make changes? We always do. The question is, are we, not people in this room, but are we, people in higher education, students and faculty and everybody involved, are we convinced that there's a need to do this? Because where there is a will, there will be a way. I do, however, want to end on a positive note, which is to say, I don't mean to paint a bleak picture. Yes, there has been pushback. Yes, progress has been very slow. But there has been progress, and that is absolutely essential to say. Things have been moving. even in my own time in academia, let's say the last, 20 years or so, I can already see change. People who have been around longer can see an even bigger change. So things are moving. And here's where I include the call to action at the end. Things are moving because there is persistent and consistent demand from people on the other side of higher education, from students and people who take interest and people who are involved, to continue in this process, to include more non-Western philosophy, to rebalance course outlines and reading lists so that it's not 95% men, 5% women, which is more common than you might think, unfortunately, right? And so this pressure needs to continue because, not because anybody is evil and mean and don't want to do it, but because institutions by their nature are slow to change, and if you leave them alone, they just keep doing the same thing. So, gently but firmly, don't leave them alone. All right, that's been my talk. Thank you very much.